Do you feel like your relationship with food is out of control? Have you found yourself trapped in cycles of overeating and dieting, unable to break free? In today's episode, we're going to peel back the layers on the science of food addiction and provide a blueprint for finding freedom. We'll explain why certain foods seem to hijack the brain's reward system, sending us into a spiral of cravings and compulsive eating. And we'll also discuss the latest research showing that food addiction is a biologically driven condition, not a moral failing or a lack of willpower. My guest today shares her incredible personal story of cycling through food obsession, binge eating, and trying every single diet under the sun before finally discovering lasting food freedom. She's since made it her life's purpose to empower others to break free as well. If you are someone who feels controlled by food rather than being in control of it, this conversation is for you. Get ready to understand yourself on a whole new level and discover a science-based path to getting your health, your body, and your life back. Hello and welcome to the Over 50 Health and Wellness Show. I'm your host, Kevin English. I'm the founder of The Silver Edge, and our mission is to help you build and maintain a lean, healthy body that you love for the rest of your life, so that you can show up in the second half of your life as the healthiest, strongest, most vital version of yourself. We have a great show for you today. Dr. Susan Peirce Thompson is here, and she's going to help us overcome food addiction. If you are someone who has struggled with impulse control around food, or you're someone who has lost and gained the same weight over and over again in your life, stick around. You won't want to miss a minute of this episode. My guest today is Dr. Susan Peirce Thompson. Dr. Thompson is an adjunct associate professor of brain and cognitive sciences at the University of Rochester, and she's an expert in the psychology of sustainable weight loss. She is the founder and CEO of Brightline Eating, and she's the author of the New York Times bestselling book, Brightline Eating: The Science of Living Happy, Thin, and Free. Dr. Thompson has helped hundreds of thousands of people overcome compulsive eating, food addiction, and yo-yo dieting to achieve healthy and lasting weight loss. I started our interview today by asking Dr. Thompson how she became interested in overcoming food addiction.
Oh, I come by this so honestly. I mean, this really is the struggle of my own personal life. I think a lot of us can relate to, ending up in some sort of path of service that it does come from our own biggest struggle. That's my story for sure. It actually started with drug addiction for me. I had a bit of a weight problem as a kid, not super bad, but by the age of 14, I discovered drugs, and they definitely helped me keep my weight in check. But it wasn't about weight then. It was really just about, partying, meeting boys, having fun. But the drugs escalated to crystal meth and then cocaine and then crack cocaine. I dropped out of high school, spent some time with prostitution as my revenue source. And at the age of 18, 19, 20, that's what I was doing. And so just after my 20th birthday, by the mercies of the universe, I got clean and sober, and I haven't had a drink or a drug in 29 years now.
Wow.
And what happened was my life got so much better, but my weight escalated out of control very quickly. And within just a few months, I could see that I was using food like I used to smoke crack. Like I was up all night binging these big quantities of food. And it wasn't just eating, it was using. It felt very familiar. And I was going to 12-step meetings talking about what I was eating when everyone else was talking about their drugs and alcohol. And they were patting me on the head and saying, "You're missing the boat here, honey. You're not smoking crack anymore. Relax about the cookies. It doesn't matter so much." And when they would say that to me, I would feel like weeping, because I would just think to myself, you have no idea how I'm eating. And if you did, you would not be saying that to me. And so finally, someone tipped me off that there were other 12-step meetings I could go to, and I went to them, but I didn't get any clarity there about what to eat or not eat exactly. And what happened was I still floundered, and for 8 more years, my weight went up and down, up and down, up and down, struggle. And in the meantime, though, the rest of my life got really good, and I was eating my way through a lot of academic success. What happened was I went to community college. I lived in California at the time, so I went to San Jose City College, and then I transferred to UC Berkeley. I crushed it there. I got 4.0s. I spoke at the graduation, and I got into every grad school I applied to and went off to get my PhD in brain and cognitive sciences. And I was studying the mind and the brain with the question, how does a brain like mine go so far off the rails? What is going on here? I did a postdoc in psychology at the University of New South Wales, and then I spent 16 years teaching college and university courses on psychology, brain and cognitive sciences, and I started teaching a college course on the psychology of eating. And I included in there, and that was just a fluke of the universe, by the way. I didn't actually set out to do that, but I was at my college that I was, getting 10, I was maybe 10, no, that was at the beginning of my tenure track career at this college. And this adjunct had developed this course called the Psychology of Eating and Body Image, the Psychology of Eating and Body Image. She'd taught it for a few years, and then it was August, and her mom had a big heart event or health event, and she up and moved to Kansas to take care of her mom. And I was low person on the totem pole, and they tapped me on the shoulder and said, will you teach this course for us? And but backtrack, it was 10 years prior to that I lost all my excess weight. And I did it through a 12-step food addiction program. I found a group of people who were holding meetings, supporting people to not eat sugar, not eat flour, and be very clear about their meals and their quantities of food. And as soon as I found that approach, I lost all my weight very fast and became a devotee of this group and did a lot of service in it and so forth. But over the years, I found very few people would go to this group because it was so doctrinaire. It was like, there's the whole 12-step world. If there's the 12-step world, these are the Navy SEALs of the 12-step world. It's like they tell you how many meetings a week you're going to, how many minutes a day you're talking with your sponsor for, and then there's this whole list of foods, not just sugar and flour, that you can't eat. You can't eat nuts. You can't eat cherries. You can't eat peas. You can't eat corn. You can't eat soup. You can't eat hummus. You can't eat, it just goes on and on and on. I did it, but when people had a weight problem and they would come to me for support, I would say, go to a meeting, and they would come out of there going, I'm not doing this. This is crazy. So I was teaching this college course on the psychology of eating. And one morning in my morning meditation, the universe said, write a book called Bright Line Eating and share with the world what the psychology and the neuroscience of what actually works for sustainable weight loss. Because at that point, I'd gone from obese to slender, and I'd kept it off for over 10 years. Now it's 20 years. And I knew that long-term sustainable weight loss was really possible. And I also knew that this group wasn't going to reach the masses and that there was science behind it. 12-step programs, I love them and they saved my life and I believe in them. And they'll be the first ones to tell you that they're not telling you why something's happening or what the science is behind it. So I knew that I had a unique message to share. And then Bright Line Eating exploded and the rest is history.
And the rest is history. And here we are having this conversation today. That's a fascinating story, by the way. I was really struck by the way you talked about when you were in that disordered eating. It sounds a lot like, and I think this is how you referred to it, you just transferred that drug addiction to a food addiction. And you said, I wasn't eating, I was using. Very, very powerful imagery there. But you've got 20 years here where you've gone from being obese, overweight, and having this disordered relationship with food, and I'm guessing also your body, to where you are today. And hats off to you, as stats are horrific when it comes to not so much losing weight, but at weight maintenance. People, 97%, if you read some studies, say of people that lose significant amounts of weight will gain all of it and perhaps extra back. So yeah. I want to talk a little bit more about that journey and specifically about and the Bright Line Eating method, what you feel is a sustainable way for weight loss. But before we get there, let's back up and kind of set the table here a little bit. When people think about emotional eating, disordered eating, food addiction, what are we talking about? What is happening here? When you mentioned I was using it, I'm guessing there's shame involved with that. Are you hiding? Are you eating alone? What is food addiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm hoping we can stay on this topic for a while because there's a lot to it, actually.
Yep, we got all the time you want.
Perfect. So the first thing I'll say is that eating disorders are different from food addiction. But the Venn diagrams overlap, and we have data on the overlap. So about 50% of people with food addiction will test positive for an eating disorder. And about 50% of people with an eating disorder will test positive for food addiction, but it depends on the details. So for example, people with active binge eating disorder or active bulimia, while it's active, almost all of them will test positive for food addiction. But as soon as the binge episodes are in remission for a bit, only about 30% of them will have any food addiction left over. Interestingly, anorexia nervosa is not, those folks are not immune to food addiction. As a matter of fact, there's subtypes of anorexia. There's the restriction only subtype, and then there's the binge subtype. And a recent study showed that just over 50% of people with the restriction only subtype test positive for food addiction. And 76% of people with the binge subtype test positive for food addiction. So what food addiction is that eating disorders are not is food addiction is about obsession and compulsion. It's about losing control over how much you eat once you start to eat it. So people who find they have this insatiable hunger where they start to eat certain foods and suddenly they find they're on a slippery slope and all their good intentions go out the window and they find themselves eating way more than they intended. And it keeps happening. It may not be a binge. So it may not qualify for a binge, which means they might not be shoveling it in a panicked state. They might not be eating far more than a normal person would eat in a typical setting, but they feel like they're losing control over how much they eat. And it keeps happening. So that's one feature. Cravings are also another feature of food addiction. So that could be driving across town to get the specific thing that's going to hit the spot. It could be you've got a craving for something and you're not sure what it is. So you're standing in front of the refrigerator or the cupboard going, what do I need? What do I need? And you see the salad and the crisper and you see the leftover, broccoli and chicken. And that's not it, right? You're looking for something to hit the spot, right? And cravings are also a feature of food addiction. And another thing is just mental obsession. The chatter, we call it food chatter in the mind. It could be food chatter, it could be scale chatter and weight chatter, right? Over what you've eaten or not eaten, whether you're on your plan or off your plan, how many miles, how many calories, how many pounds, the new thing you're starting, whether you've fallen off track, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And people with food addiction will sometimes feel like, I got to get this under control just so I can give my gifts to the world fully, just so I can be focused on my creative projects and my family and my work. Like I'm spending way too much time thinking about all this. And the brain components of cravings and hunger are worth talking about. And so is the willpower gap, which ends up being essentially the crux of the issue for long-term adherence to any sort of healthy eating plan. The willpower gap, I believe, is really the crux of the issue when it comes to weight loss maintenance. I mean, and then we haven't even talked about the shame piece that you brought up and the emotions, which are a part, but not as central as you might think. The real central issue is that for some brains, processed foods and modern patterns of eating have hijacked the brain and are now driving the bus, essentially. The brain is not letting you not eat anymore. The brain is forcing you to eat in ways you don't even realize, because when the brain does that, it convinces you that you chose it. And that's a very interesting feature of the brain that neuroscientists have discovered, that when the brain makes you do something, the first thing it does is it flips the switch that makes you think you decided to. So you're deciding to order a pizza on a Friday night, but that was not a decision. It was the brain saying, this must happen now.
It was a foregone decision, I suppose. So that's fascinating. So, and hence the word addiction. This is truly an addiction. And you mentioned that compulsion, obsession, the cravings, and the chatter that are all in there. And I hadn't really thought about it because in my mind, I was using eating disorder and food addiction kind of synonymously as sort of the same thing. So there's that distinction, but that overlap in between the two. Now, when you talk about addiction, food addiction, we just have a pretty good definition of what it is. Why are we addicted to food?
Well, because food's not food anymore.
Yeah.
Because our food has been adulterated in the same way that they make cocaine and heroin, they're making quote unquote food now, right? So if you think about what a drug is, where it comes from, right? Let's take two drugs that everyone agrees are drugs, heroin and cocaine, right? Unquestionably drugs. Well, they come from somewhere, right? They're processed before they hit the streets. What happens is with cocaine, the coca leaf is taken. Now, there's actually a published scientific article showing that the hikers in the Andes Mountains who are putting coca leaves in their cheek and chewing them, they're not addicted and they don't get high, right? Their cheek gets a little numb and the effect is like drinking a smidge of caffeinated tea or something, but it doesn't reach the level of addiction. But when you take the inner essence of those coca leaves and then you refine and purify it down into a fine white powder, you've turned it into a drug. You've taken a harmless plant that has a bit of activity to it, but it's not particularly psychoactive, and you've turned it into a drug. Heroin is the same deal, right? Heroin comes from the poppy plant. And maybe your listeners know that if you eat too many poppy seed bagels, you will actually fail a drug test, right? Like that is actually opiate right there in those poppy seeds. But you won't have gotten high, and you certainly won't be, to use a stereotype, breaking into your grandmother's house to steal her VCR to get more dope, right? To get more poppy seed bagels.
Yeah.
But what they did was they took the inner essence of those poppy plants and they refined and purified it down into a fine brown powder or a sludgy goo, and they turned it into heroin, right? So what we're doing now with our food supply is we're taking whole real foods like corn, like beets, like wheat, like rice, like potatoes that are perfectly fine and reasonable to eat. By the way, all whole real foods are on the Bright Line Eating Plan. There's not a single whole real food that we don't eat in Bright Line Eating. So when people tell me that I'm creating eating disorders by eliminating categories of food, my first thought is, since when did sugar become a food group? Mm-hmm. Like, we just need to pause and think about that for a second, right? Sugar is not a food group. So yeah, we're taking, let's say corn, right? And we're taking the inner essence of it and refining and purifying it down into this sludgy goo that is high fructose corn syrup. And that's turning it into a drug. So what happens in the brain is these quote unquote foods, these bagels, donuts, pancakes, waffles, pasta, white bread, on and on and on. These so-called foods, these cookies, these ice cream, all the stuff, these ultra-processed foods are hitting the dopamine receptors in the nucleus accumbens and flooding them with levels of dopamine that are just not achievable by any natural food. And what happens is those receptors compensate. First of all, they go, whoa, and then they compensate by thinning out, so that the next time the response is more moderate. And so now you're rewiring the brain for addiction. You're flooding the brain with dopamine. It's responding by downregulating those receptors. And now you're fine as long as you're dosing up with sugar and flour every couple hours. But if you don't get your dose, now you feel restless, you feel irritable, you feel discontented, you feel itchy. Something is not right in your world. And now you need some more just to feel normal, not to feel high, just to feel okay, to get through the day. And that's addiction. That is literally addiction. And I could show you PET scans of the brain of the cocaine brain and the ultra-processed food brain, and they look identical. As a matter of fact, to my eye, the food brain looks a little worse. So we're not talking about addiction, food addiction here as a hypothesis, as a metaphor, as an analogy. We're talking about actual, literal brain addiction. And this is the last thing I'll say on this point. The original studies in mice that tracked the dopamine response in the mesolimbic reward pathway, the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, those original studies, what they gave the mice to produce the addictive dopamine response was glucose.
Sugar.
That's what they gave the mice. And all the studies were done based on glucose. And then they did, oh, look, yes, cocaine works the same. Heroin works the same. It's addiction.
Okay, it's addiction, and our food is, to your point, this ultra-processed, hyper-palatable food is addictive. And it's not a coincidence that this food is addictive. It's not an accident that this food is addictive. There are PhD scientists whose job it is to create this. I'm sure you've heard that term bliss point, where these food scientists will create food to be ultra palatable and have just the right amount of sweet, salt, crisp, fat. And they have these these very complicated studies to really manufacture this food to be addictive. And I've never heard it put quite as succinctly or as eloquently as you just described the why that food is addictive. As a nutrition coach, I see it all the time. We know that Americans now eat about, on average, 70+% of their diet from processed and ultra-processed foods. And we wonder why we're spending this obscene amount in healthcare, and yet our health is deteriorating, and we're becoming fatter, not thinner. We're becoming unhealthier as opposed to more healthy. And I think that certainly the food supply, or what we're calling these food-like substances, and their addictive properties there. And I hadn't thought about addiction as, I just need this. I need another hit. I need another dose, just not to get high, but just to get back to baseline, just to feel normal. And so we can see how this could really be a problem for overcoming this, which, and I want to talk, obviously we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about how do we break this up, right? We are going to get there.
Yeah.
But it seems to me when we talk about addiction, where's the intersection between, say, this food addiction and mental health? Is this a mental health disorder? Is this something that we're sort of helpless because it's so addictive?
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's a great question. So if you're in the field, you've heard maybe about these models like the biopsychosocial model or the diathesis stress model. I can explain those easily. I think they're very apropos. Basically, the biopsychosocial model says that any condition, really, you need to look at it from the biological standpoint. That's kind of what we were just talking about, right? Dopamine flooding into the brain, biological stuff, chemicals in the brain, but the psychological stuff too. And sure enough, we absolutely see that this is far more common in people with high ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences scores. There's an easy test you can take online, but brace yourself. It's a whopper of a test. It'll ask you heavy questions about your childhood, and it'll give you a score from 1 to 10 of like, how much did you endure as a little kid? With someone with a 0 or 1 ACE score having maybe endured close to no trauma, or maybe their parents got divorced at some point, but all the way up to the most profound levels of abuse and neglect. And absolutely that has an effect. And I'm not advocating for these studies. I'm just going to inform you that they have been done, where they've taken colonies of mice who are addictable and other colonies of mice who are not addictable, because it is genetic. And you can see this, alcoholism, obesity, drug addiction, they run in families, right? Smoking, just look in your family tree, right? How many people are hooked on food, alcohol, cigarettes, drugs, etc. And so it's genetic. But if you take the babies of non-addictable mice and you rear them in horrific conditions, a percentage of those baby mice will turn out to be addictable. But if you raise them regularly, with their parents and eating enough food and so forth, none of them will become addictable. And so the biopsychosocial model, right, social factors also play a role here, right? And the diathesis stress model basically says the diathesis is the underlying predilection or predisposition or maybe genetic inclination. And then the stress is like what happens in your life to stress you enough to make the condition manifest. But what I've just said here is a pretty heavy thing, which is some folks are not addictable. Some brains, research shows, human brains are not addictable. It's about 1/3 of brains. So this has a big implication. First of all, not everybody is addicted to something. And we need to all stop saying that, please. Addiction is eating pints of ice cream with tears streaming down your face. Addiction is you want to stop and you can't stop. That's addiction. Everyone has bad habits. Everyone has vices, inclinations to do something that maybe they think is wrong or maybe not in their best interest. That's not necessarily addiction. You need to start veering into the realm of, use despite consequences, trying to stop and not being able to stop for it to be addiction, right? And 1/3 of brains just don't wire for it. They just don't. A third of brains are moderately addictable, and a third of brains are highly addictable. And I have a quiz that puts this in the domain of food to say, where are you on the spectrum of food addiction susceptibility? Because food addiction is real, but it's not a binary construct. So people are more or less susceptible to food addiction. It's a scale from 1 to 10. And if you're a 1 or a 2 or a 3, a lot of the solutions I'm going to be talking about later in this podcast episode, they're not going to apply to you. Unless you've gained a bunch of weight through bad habits and just eating too many ultra-processed foods, and you're a structure type person and you want a good solution to get that weight off. Because I will say, actually, shockingly, BMI doesn't correlate that tightly with food addiction. So it would be really easy to say, well, 1/3 of the population is highly susceptible to food addiction and 1/3 is moderately. And oh, look, 1/3 of the population is obese and 1/3 of the population is overweight. And that must track perfectly. It doesn't. It doesn't overlay like that. And so there's plenty of people who are in a regular size body, like whatever, a healthy BMI, shall we say, whatever. But they're keeping themselves that way by, running 10 miles and then obsessing all day about the 1 cup of non-fat frozen yogurt they're going to allow themselves to eat. And then there's other people that literally have class 3 or class 4 extreme morbid obesity on board, and they actually are moderate or even maybe possibly 12% low on the food addiction susceptibility scale, with bodies and genes that are predisposed to socking on a lot of weight and really bad eating habits. And they just are getting very large with that combination. Doesn't necessarily mean that food addiction is on board. Now, I will say if they start to try to lose that weight, they might develop more food addiction, because weight loss actually, unfortunately, and this is a Chinese finger trap of the worst proportions, weight loss kicks up food addiction often. So how about them apples? But anyway, yeah, so there's a lot to say about all this. And yeah, it's interesting stuff.
Certainly is. And I've never heard that term non-addictable in any sense. But it seems to me, though, just looking around in my own personal experience, that kind of makes sense, right? There are some people that they can't help it. They fall into that addiction. And there are other people that just seem to, even though they may have similar life circumstances, just don't seem to have that. And that you're saying that could be a genetic predisposition. Okay, very, very fascinating.
Yeah,
so we have
look around you and look for the people that they drink a cup of coffee or two every morning,
Sure.
But if they're traveling and there's only decaf available, they're fine.
Yeah.
And they don't get a headache. Yeah. They're like, no, I don't care. They'll have a cigarette at a concert and not think of another cigarette for months or years until they literally can just have me. I have a cigarette. I'm buying another pack that night and puking. Like that is what happens when I have a puff of a cigarette. Yeah.
So is it possible then that I could have that addictive trait in one area of my life, but not others? Maybe I have an addiction to this unhealthy habit, but I'm fine around food. Is that a thing?
Yeah, it is a thing, but there's nuance. So yes, it's a thing. So for me, for example, I have been addicted to almost everything. I mean, I've worked the 12 steps in 5 different 12-step programs, and I earned it, food, drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, sex. Those are the biggies. But shopping, could care less. I go to the mall, the lights give me a headache. I one-click whatever on Amazon, grateful that I need it. Don't ever think about shopping in any context. But I am susceptible. So maybe my husband dies, maybe my whole family dies in a car accident unexpectedly. I'm going through a horrible season of my life. A girlfriend comes over and takes me out to some boutiques, and I find myself having one of the better days I've had in a long time. And suddenly my brain goes, oh, that did the trick. And it might need to happen again and again, where my brain goes, this was good. And then I spend an evening doing some Christmas shopping. You get the picture, right?
Yeah.
So what needs to happen is it needs to wire up in a specific domain where the cues that predict the rewards start to get entrained in the brain in that domain, right? So people can absolutely have addiction in one area, but not another, and mercifully skate through their life with their brain having never noticed that those cues predict those rewards, and it hits the spot in that kind of way. But that doesn't mean their brain will never notice that. They're still vulnerable to it. It just has to wire up in that domain over time. It takes time for those wirings to happen.
Sure.
The first time I smoked crack, I thought I hated it. I was like, that was lame. I will never get hooked on that. That was awful.
And then you were
but
addicted to crack.
Tried it again because I thought I was safe.
Yeah.
and then before long, I was seeking it out.
Yeah. Okay. So there's that saying, the brain wires together, fires together, right? We have this concept of neuroplasticity. So all of a sudden the brain is finding these grooves and digging those grooves deeper and deeper, I suppose, is one way of kind of looking at that subconsciously learned behavior. And that's how I may not be addicted, in your example, to shopping, but all of a sudden that is serving some purpose. And unbeknownst to me, all of a sudden I'm a shopaholic, even though I didn't have that, maybe necessarily that quote unquote addictive type personality, right? We all know people that have addictive personalities, I suppose, and that shows up a lot of time. You had mentioned like people that are obsessed with fitness, or people that are obsessed with even what we would consider healthy type things. But I suppose when you're in the actual realm of addiction, that's not a healthy place to be. Whether the behaviors seem to be outwardly okay or healthy, still, if it's addictive behavior, is it safe to say that's unhealthy from a psychological standpoint?
Well, this is an important question because I actually want to invite your listeners to consider stop using the term addiction in that way, carelessly or loosely. So addiction does require that you're hurting yourself with something and trying to stop and not being able to, or maybe you haven't tried to stop yet, but you really should because you're hurting yourself, right? So taking some of the attributes that often correlate with addiction, like a zealous pursuit of something, an enthusiasm for it, repeated doing of it, to, not wanting to not do it, those in and of themselves don't spell addiction. So when people say things like, oh, my cousin just joined AA, but now they're just addicted to AA, I'm like, hold on here, right? Like, they're going to meetings, getting sober, their life is getting better. This is their community support. And I bristle at the use of the word addiction in that way. Now, maybe if they're not going to work and they're ignoring their family and they're trying to cut back on their AA meetings so they can get to work, now that's addiction, right? But usually it's not in that ballpark, and people are still using that term.
Okay, no, that's a fair distinction, and that's exactly the way I was using it, is that more colloquial sense of, oh, he's addicted to working out, he's addicted to this, he's addicted to his work, he's an entrepreneur, he's addicted to, etc. That's not really addiction. That is, you can say that's commendable.
There are people addicted to exercise, and they're exercising on knee injuries, right? And they're going to go out and run 10 miles, when they need to be resting.
There's a word for it. Is it orthorexia? Something like that. There is a term for that, and it very often shows up in either nutrition, and now we're of course talking about disordered eating, but it's that very, very healthy, obsessed, and that's moving probably a little closer into the realm of food addiction. So all right, so I think we've got a really good framework here to start our discussion. So somebody who's got a food addiction, they're somewhere on that spectrum, right? From moderate to severe. What are our steps to get unaddicted, basically? What are the steps that we take to get whole, to get healthy?
So the first thing is you got to know where you stand. So that quiz, that scale that I mentioned from 1 to 10, you need to know where you are, because if you're a 5, that's one thing. If you're a 10, that's a whole other beast. And even a 7 is pretty different from a 10. So foodaddictionquiz.com will give you your number. It's like a 5-question quiz. It's so quick. It'll take a minute to take that quiz, if that. Foodaddictionquiz.com. So start there and get a sense of what you're working with, because you need a diagnosis before you can know what the prescription or the treatment is going to look like, right? Let's imagine you take that quiz and you are like an 8 or a 9 or a 10, really high on that scale. Now, you're also going to need to ask yourself, do you have weight to lose? How much weight? That's going to factor in because, like I said, weight loss can kick up food addiction, and sustaining weight loss is really hard, even for people who have no food addiction on board. So if you've got the double whammy of a weight challenge that you want to address and a food addiction, if you're serious about wanting to address it and wanting to really heal, my honest professional opinion is you are going to need to swallow some pretty bitter pills about the truth of your condition. You're pretty far gone. And it's going to take a pretty intensive treatment protocol to get you into the realm of, well and fit and slender and whatever you're looking to be, right? The good news is that the treatment will lead you way, way better off before you ever even were before you got the disease. So the good news is that the treatment is amazing. But if you don't submit yourself to it fully and you try to dabble, it's not going to work. And what you're going to do is you're going to put yourself in a realm of being on again, off again, feeling bad about it, and kind of half measuring your way to misery, essentially. It really does require a concerted effort and belonging to a full-fledged program to treat it. That's what it requires.
Okay, so first step here is to get a baseline, right? Before we can have a prescription, we're going to have a diagnosis. So let's just stay on this. Let's say somebody is a 7, 8, 9. They're pretty high up there. Let's just create this blueprint of this program that you were just referencing. What might that look like for somebody? They find they've got this food addiction and they've got a weight challenge. And you mentioned this is going to be a tough road. We're not going to sugarcoat this. What might the steps look like in order to get well?
Yeah. So I think there are two honest options. There are some more, but I'll give you the asterisk. Okay, the first one is Bright Line Eating. That's the program I created. Obviously, there's a conflict of interest in me telling you that, but that's my honest take on the lay of the land. One of them is Bright Line Eating. The other is FA, or Food Addicts and Recovery Anonymous. There are other 12-step programs that are good too. What you're looking for is a program that's very specific about what to eat. Overeaters Anonymous, unfortunately, isn't any more specific enough. They started in 1960 with food plans and specificity. They're the original 12-step food program. But somewhere along the way, they realized that experts can't even agree on what people should eat. So they got out of the food plan game. And since they got out of the food plan game, they're kind of like AA saying, come to support meetings, but you can decide whether you want to drink or not. And it's shockingly far less effective. Yeah. So the other programs I'm aware of that will give you clear guidance on what to eat are like Gray Sheeters Anonymous, CEA How, FAA, Food Addicts Anonymous, not to be confused with Food Addicts and Recovery Anonymous. So there's a few of them that give you specific guidance on what to eat. The main differences between a 12-step program and Bright Line Eating are Bright Line Eating will teach you the science. 12-step programs won't do that. 12-step programs are free unless you feel really compelled to put $2 in the basket when they pass the basket, right? Then they're not free. Then if you're going to a lot of meetings, that can add up. 12-step programs have you get a sponsor right away, which puts a lot of the onus on your success and your experience in the program on whether you find a good sponsor and a fit for you. Because they're not paid, they're not trained, and people's experience really varies, right? So if you get a sponsor that you don't enjoy working with or that's giving you guidance that you don't trust, basically your whole experience is colored by that. So it's a little bit of a buyer beware situation. If you find a great sponsor, you can have a great experience in a 12-step program. And again, 12-step programs saved my life. I recommend them. They're amazing. So if you go to FA, if you go to a 12-step program, you're going to look up their website. You're going to go to a meeting. A lot of meetings are online now, thanks to the pandemic. And you're going to just go find a sponsor. They're going to tell you what to eat. And they're probably going to tell you to call them for 15 minutes at dark 30 tomorrow morning and tell you what you're going to eat for the day. And you just do what they say. And you're successful by doing what they say to the letter. In Bright Line Eating, you're the author of your own journey. So you're not going to just take orders from a sponsor. You're going to do the program, which is an online transformational curriculum. The other main difference between Bright Line Eating and the 12 Steps is the 12 Steps are a God-centered spiritual transformation program through the 12 Steps. Bright Line Eating uses inner work with a psychological methodology or treatment approach, I guess, or framework called internal family systems therapy, which is about parts work. It's about finding the parts of you that feel different ways about things. Like maybe you have a food indulger part that wants to eat the cookie and a food controller part that doesn't want you to eat the cookie. And you get to meet those parts of you and sort of reconcile them. So it's a very powerful evidence-based branch of psychology. And that's how we do the inner work in Bright Line Eating. So in Bright Line Eating, what you need to do is you need to start the Bright Line Eating Boot Camp. It's a 10-week transformational course. It's not offered all the time. You can go to our website at brightlineeating.com and see when it's offered next. And yeah, once you take that quiz, you'll be on our email list, but we'll tell you when the next boot camp is starting. And then you're on a path. We call it the Bright Roadmap, and it's a 2-year transformational journey. And then the people who are successful, they stick around. They stay in the community. They maybe go through the Bright Roadmap again. They find ways to be of service in our community. They do more inner work. They stay, what we call stay close to the mothership. And I'm not the mothership. The whole community is the mothership. Right. You stay, as we say, no one ever falls off the middle of the wagon, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, that's fascinating. Now, do you consider, so for example, an alcoholic will say, I am a recovering alcoholic, not a recovered alcoholic. Is that the same? Do you guys have that same philosophy then when we're talking about overcoming food addiction? Are you cured, or are you just on the journey? You're somewhere on, you're on the path. You had mentioned I'm 20 years in this way of managing my body. Are you cured, or are you still an addict, but you're just in remission? How do you talk about that?
Yeah, great question. Science really comes to the rescue here. And just to inform you, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous actually uses the word recovered, ED.
Oh,
we have recovered.
Okay.
Yeah. But, asterisk, they say we have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. We are not cured. What we really have is a daily reprieve contingent on the maintenance of our spiritual condition. So that's where they weave in. We have recovered from alcoholism. We've recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, but we're not cured of alcoholism. We just have a daily reprieve. So here's how that works in the brain. It's very clear in the brain. There is truth. I'm so sorry for me and all the people who have it to say it is actually true. Once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. Here's how it works in the brain. There are several lines of research that show that once something is learned, it never really becomes unlearned. It can go extinct, but that's not unlearned. And here's the difference. So as we get experiences, as we wire up addiction, we wire fiber tracks in the brain, these systems of neurons wiring together and energy flowing through them, very much like water over dry land will over time groove a riverbed, right? And let's imagine you've been an active food addict for decades. You've been eating addictively, right? You've got a raging river with a very deep groove. It may not be the Grand Canyon, but that's a whopper of a river. Now, you can use Bright Line Eating and go upstream and dam that river and redirect the water elsewhere. And that water now needs to flow over dry land, which will be awkward, and it will take time for new grooves to develop. So this is where when people say, oh, here's how many days it takes to form a habit, I roll my eyes, right? Like that water is grooving a riverbed continuously. And there's no point at which you can point to it and say, now it's a river, right? It is true that if you come back years later, you've got a river. So at what point is that, right? Now you've got this other river, but what have you got over there? You've got a dry riverbed is what you've got. And if you start, even after decades, yeah, some grasses and some shrubs will have grown into it. But if you start letting significant water flow back in that direction, you will have a rager very fast. And that is exactly how the brain works. Like the person who lived in, Germany as a little kid and moved somewhere when they were 4 years old may never hear a word of German, adopted to China when they were 4 years old, never hears a word of German, can go back to Germany at the age of 80 and will be a native speaker so fast it'll blow your mind. So it's not that some relearning doesn't need to happen or some, getting back up to speed doesn't need to happen, but you never unlearn anything. So, yeah, and there's all kinds of bodies of literature on that. There's Pavlovian conditioning literature, there's language learning literature, there's neuroplasticity literature, there's a whole bunch of literature on that. So I'm sorry, friends, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. And this is why when you go take the quiz at foodaddictionquiz.com, the first thing it's going to ask you is think back to a stretch of eating, like a 3-month chunk of time when your eating was at its worst. And answer these questions as if it were that time. Because unfortunately, even if those behaviors are not raging in that way, you're going to need to be vigilant in a way that someone who had never eaten like that just won't have to.
Okay, so we have these rivers, these neural pathways, these grooves that are dug really, really deep. And I love that illustration of thinking, okay, I've built a dam upstream, so I don't have a raging torrent of that unhealthy behavior right now. But I suppose that's only as reliable as that dam is fortified and maintained, I suppose, right? And meanwhile,
Yes.
I've got that water's got to go somewhere. And you, as you so eloquently said, now it's kind of awkward. It has to go somewhere else, and now it's got to find. So it's going back over dry ground, and eventually it will create a new groove, a new neural pathway. But there's going to be some awkwardness until that happens, and I think that's kind of gives us an idea of why you said, what did you say? It's a 10-week boot camp and a 2-year journey, and then probably a lifetime in a community for this to really work. Now, for somebody who's interested in maybe learning more about what's going to happen inside this 2-year journey, you mentioned some inner work. Is this going to be more psychological work, behavior-based work? What are we doing here? Obviously, there's going to be that you had mentioned earlier, this biopsychosocial. I'm guessing all 3 of those elements are in your program as well, right? We're rewiring some things. We're making new communities. But what do I expect in 2 years of working with you folks? What does it look like week over week, month over month?
Yeah, great question. So the course consists of video modules of me doing a lot of talking, and then people in the community, we call them panelists, who've been through the program, sharing their experience. These are videos that are edited together. You can listen to the audio tracks, right? And we put people into groups, and we give them, ways to find buddies and mastermind groups, and later on, whole teams of people. We call it the Gideon Games, where there's contests where teams of people get together and compete and stuff. It's super fun. The community's super rich with layers of connectedness. And we published a study recently that showed that people's feelings of being loved, supported, and connected in the world and not lonely anymore skyrocket through our program. Also, their feelings of happiness and well-being and flourishing skyrocket. Also, their energy levels skyrocket. Also, their depression plummets and their days of depressed mood plummet. So it's a super psychologically effective program. The interesting thing is that the inner work, the psychological work, takes mainly 2 forms. Some is healing work, right? A lot of us were eating over stuff, and there's some healing work to be done. But interestingly, I find that the most important inner work is around the psychology of orienting to maintenance. As a concept, as a reality, people coming into Bright Line Eating have typically tried over and over and over again to lose their weight, like 16 different programs or attempts. I mean, just over and over again or more. I think we had a survey, and most people ticked the 16 plus box, right? And they have parts of themselves that just can't even orient toward the journey as this problem is now solved and I don't have it anymore kind of situation. There's a lot of deep psychology that goes into if you've allocated 30, 40, 70, 90% of your mental focus and efforts in life, like your excess kind of mojo in life toward your food and your weight, right? To have that problem solved is a huge psychological issue.
Sure.
The vacuum that creates in your life is enormous. And who are you then? And what are you doing with your life then? You better have a backup plan, because we're going to solve your food and your weight problem. So, buddy, you better have some hobbies or something else to think about, because what you've eaten or not eaten is not going to be on your mind anymore, right? That one's solved. So that's a lot of the issue is people often come and can develop the identity of a bright lifer. I love bright line eating and I'm doing this. But then sometimes we watch them if they don't handle the second identity shift, which is I'm a successful maintainer and this is not my problem anymore. What happens is they get 100 pounds off and then they tinker with the last 10. So they're always still thinking about what they've eaten or not eaten, how they're, changing their food plan. And so they're still obsessed with it. Now, everyone around them says, oh my God, bright line eating's worked for you so well. I'm saying there's another level of wholeness and wellness to achieve here, right? And so our whole system addresses that.
Gotcha. Okay, so there's the behavioral psychological part. Let's talk about the food part. Now, we started this whole conversation talking about just the horrors of this ultra processed food that we're addicted to now. What is the prescription coming into your program for eating? What am I just day one, we cutting out all processed foods? Are we taking small steps? Are you 80-20? How does that work for somebody who's on the higher end of that food addiction spectrum?
Yeah, so we take a bright line approach. That's the name bright line eating comes from. A bright line in legalese is a clear, unambiguous boundary that you just don't cross to produce consistent, reliable results. That's what a bright line rule is in the law. And so bright line eating is we got some bright lines that we put up. Just like if you're going to quit smoking, you need to have a bright line for cigarettes. You might wear a patch for a bit, but then that's going to end and you got a bright line. You don't take that first puff of the first cigarette, no matter what. And so our bright lines are sugar, flour, meals, and quantities. And the first two bright lines, sugar and flour, address the substance addiction, the actual ultra-processed food addiction. The second two bright lines address the eating addiction because eating is actually rewarding and cue-laden enough to develop its own behavioral addiction. And this is where you'll often see people classify food addiction as a behavioral addiction. Other people will say, no, it's ultra-processed foods as a substance addiction. And I'm here to say it's both. Mm-hmm. It's actually both. And the two bright lines for meals and quantities are required as well.
All right. So we have the sugar, the flour, the meals, the quantity. And I take it our bright line is going to be sugar, no, flour, no. And basically the only place we find those things is in ultra-processed foods, right? And then you're going to have some sort of structure around meals and around quantity of food. And now what about, and I suppose you guys, because there's we eat for a lot of different reasons, right? We eat for emotional reasons when we're stressed or we're bored or we're angry, all kinds of things. We eat when we're biologically hungry, but we eat in joy and celebration. We eat for occasions. We eat with families and holidays and traditions. Somebody who's got an eating addiction, how do you manage the cultural part? Are you just really bringing them into your family and kind of, this is my new eating family now? How would one who still has to navigate the real world with family and work and all the different cultures and eating cultures that go with each of those different environments that they're moving through, how are you guys helping them sort through that? I guess that's back onto the psychological side, right?
It's a big deal. And we focus on it a lot. I'm a mother of 3 kids. We've got 6 grandparents that live locally here. My husband's mom and dad and my mom and her husband and my dad and his wife. And we live a full, flourishing life. And life is in session and everything is organized around food. So this is not a trivial thing. Right. The whole boot camp really teaches you, how do you eat out? How do you eat in social occasions? How do you travel? What do you say when your mother-in-law is suddenly like, what do you mean you're not eating these cookies? You love these cookies. Right. How do you how do you navigate that? Right. And forget about it. If you're Puerto Rican, or Cuban, and suddenly you're trying to tell your mother-in-law you're not going to eat her food, that's a whole different story, right? So there are cultures in which it's a much bigger deal, right? So, and I have to say, if we all just breathe for a second, we can recognize that if you are allergic to peanuts, no matter how much you loved your mother-in-law, if she'd baked peanut butter cookies, you wouldn't be eating one, right? And so what happens is we teach you through time how to find that place of like when you're really clear that that's not your food. The question becomes, how do I transcend from a place where food has been the proxy for connection and love, and realize that actually all along it was a pretty poor proxy for real connection and sharing of love. That the reality is that people in parallel shoveling food into their mouths are not really connecting and not really showing all the signs of love. And when we're out of that food trance, we can now show up in ways that we never could before. And Thanksgiving can actually be a warmer, brighter, better day when we're focused on thanks and giving than it is when we're focused on what we're going to eat and then feeling terrible afterwards, right? And so we bring the love and the connection and the meaning back into these holidays, back into these social gatherings, and we give people the words for the conversations that sometimes need to happen with a spouse or a mother-in-law or a friend at work when we say, you know what, I've been bonding with you for many years over food. And it's true that I'm not doing that anymore, but I want to have a conversation with you because the changes I've made in my life, they matter to me and you matter to me. And I want to talk about how we can bond deeper now and how I want to stay connected with you. And this does not mean that I don't want to socialize with you or be with you, but I ask for your support and I want to co-create a world in which we can, do something other than, the pizza bowling night that we used to do and enjoy so much, but can we find a way to make it work? I'm happy to keep showing up to pizza and bowling night and not eat the pizza, but is that okay with you? Can you accept me not eating that pizza? I don't want, it's not going to work for me anymore. Or should we find something else to do? Is there a shared passion we have, etc., right? So we teach people, we literally give them some conversation scripts sometimes, and it takes them a while to experience these gatherings without food as being the proxy for love and connection, but people end up feeling more connected to what matters in their world and to the people that matter in their world.
That's beautifully spoken. Thank you for sharing that. And it occurs to me as you're saying that also that I show up as the best version of myself when I'm healthy. So that a healthier Kevin shows up as a better Kevin in pretty much all cases. And that's mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and certainly physically, right? And so as these people are on their journey and they're becoming this best version of themselves, they're more able to live purpose-driven lives, are more able to connect deeply with loved ones, it seems to me. And so maybe the challenge of navigating some of these societal, cultural norms might be difficult at first, but I think that just the way you shared that script really is, hey, how can we connect even deeper? And I still have it in my mind that we do connect over food. We do connect over, and some people are connecting over, a glass of wine for date night, things like that. And while, the nutrition coach in me says, well, that cup of wine is basically metabolic poison. However, there might be a value for somebody who's not addicted and is not on that scale. The little bit of metabolic poison that's in that glass of wine might be offset by that moment in time where they're deeply connecting with their partner. They're enjoying something that they love that's doing, let's just say, minimal harm. But in the case where we have somebody that has this more intense addiction, structuring their lives and learning how to navigate that, just all of that just seems like a better way. It is a better way for those people to show up for the rest of their lives, right? As more loving, caring, healthy human beings. And so it certainly makes a lot of sense to me. All right. Well, Susan, as we're wrapping up here, I know you've got your new book out, On This Bright Day, A Year of Reflections for Lasting Food Freedom. You've got obviously this program. What's on the horizon for you? What are you excited about? What do you got on deck here for the next year or so?
I'm part of a consortium of professionals worldwide who are working to get food addiction recognized in the DSM and the ICD, as it should be. And so working hard on that endeavor. And I have a community that's sizable, so I can participate in some of the research studies that need to be done. Essentially, I think, incontrovertible evidence now that food addiction is a real disease. What we don't have much data on are treatment protocols. And it's hard to get data on treatment for a condition that's not really a recognized condition. So that's a bit of a catch-22. But I can do it with my community because it's sizable. And running some studies is where I'm going with that. Particularly a study that looks at, for people with food addiction, an abstinence-based, like a bright line-based eating plan is what works. Whereas eating disorder treatment these days is a no food rules, no bad foods protocol. And they're literally punishing people in inpatient eating disorder treatments for not eating the cupcakes that they're making them eat. And so running some studies showing that, those people with binge eating disorder and bulimia who don't have food addiction underlying their condition, that they do better with that approach. But that for the people who are not being served, who do have food addiction on board, they need an abstinence-based approach, showing that that fork in the road, that difference is what we want to do with our studies. I also just published a study, well, not just, but I think it's going to be very apropos for your community, so I want to mention it. It was a very large study. We had 4,509 subjects in this study. That's a pretty big sample size. Across 4,000, and the reason we needed such a big sample size is because it was an age study. So 4,509 people went through the Bright Line Eating Boot Camp. On average, they lost a ton of weight. How much weight? As much weight as people lose on semaglutide drugs, interestingly. So if you look at, this is a sidebar, but if you look at our published in peer-reviewed journals, the Journal of Nutrition and Weight Loss, and you look at the published results of semaglutide drugs, people doing Bright Line Eating lose that much weight without any negative side effects or the $16,000 a year cost that Wegovy is right now. And those 4,509 people did the Bright Line Eating Bootcamp, lost a ton of weight. And Kevin, there was zero difference in amount of weight lost or how fast it was lost between people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, 80s.
Love it.
Literally no difference.
Yeah,
and you might say, well, we all know it's harder to lose weight after midlife, right? We know that it is harder to lose weight. The reason it's harder to lose weight is because estrogens, which both men and women have, estrogens plummet after midlife, and estrogens have a facilitating effect on insulin, which is a fat storage and fat release hormone. So without estrogen on board, it's just way harder to lose weight, especially in certain areas like the gut. However, if you're not eating sugar and flour anymore ever, you're not jacking around your blood sugar and needing the insulin to be quite as effective. And suddenly the playing field is leveled, and literally, women in their 50s and 60s and 70s are losing weight like they're 20 years old again, and it's blowing their minds. So that's really fun.
Yeah, I love that. And if you combine that sort of a protocol with adding, some sort of resistance training, so we're adding a little bit of muscle. We know that muscle is a glucose disposal site. We've got a recipe there for a very happy, healthy, vital human being, don't we? Absolutely love it. All right. Well, Susan, where do you want to send people? I know we talked about foodaddictionquiz.com. Certainly, if you're somebody who's curious where you might fall on that, I strongly suggest you go over there. It's brightlineeating.com is just your website. If people are interested in the program, I'm sure they can find more there. Where else would you want to send people?
That's it. Just go to those places. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Go there. Take the quiz. Start with just informing yourself. Right. Where are you on a scale from 1 to 10? It's really simple.
I'm gonna hop off here and do that myself. I'm just kind of curious. And I know you're on all the socials, all of that. So folks, I will put all of this information into the show notes. You guys can find that there. Susan, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today, sharing your story with us, being willing to be vulnerable, and just sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. And I just really love the work you're doing. Just encourage you to keep up the great work.
Thanks so much, Kevin. What a pleasure.
Okay, that's our show for today, folks. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I want to let you know that we have other free resources over at silveredgefree.com. There you'll find our free guides with our top tips on nutrition, exercise, and healthy lifestyle to assist you in your weight loss and fitness journey. So feel free to head over there and download anything that looks useful to you. I'll put links to everything we talked about today in the show notes, and you folks can find those over at silveredgefitness.com/250. As we wrap up our time together today, you can show your support for this show in two important ways. The first is to tell a friend about this podcast and encourage them to give it a listen. The second is for you YouTube folks to click the like and subscribe buttons, and for you podcast folks to please give this podcast a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on, and be sure to subscribe and follow so you don't miss any future episodes. I really appreciate you spending your time with me today, and until next time, stay strong.